to Afternoon Light, the podcast at the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. When Robert Menzies began his Forgotten People broadcasts in 1942, the centre-right, of which he was part, was in crisis. Through his articulation of an enduring set of ideas and principles which formed Australian liberalism, Menzies brought together 18 disparate groups to form a political movement that 79 years on still exists. But it's fair to say that today's party of the centre-right across countries like Australia, Britain and the United States have seen better days. Joining me to discuss the challenge to the centre-right is Fraser Nelson, editor of The Spectator. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Fraser.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you on, and we're very much looking forward to you delivering the Menzies oration on the 19th of October. And your predecessor, last year's orator, was someone you have actually quite a bit in common with, I was reflecting, Jonathan Sumption. You delivered the Keith Joseph lecture in 2010, and he wrote a book with Keith Joseph in 1981.
Yes, Jonathan Sumption is one of the great minds. We call him the cleverest man in England,
yes.
Generally speaking, at The Spectator. And I think his speech to Robert Menzies' dinner last year was absolutely a landmark, even in his own thinking. He was pointing out that the great problem with society wasn't so much that implemented lockdowns without really any proof that they worked, but the fact that so many people wanted, demanded, were begging for these lockdowns. And he detected in this a kind of popular demand for less freedom, less liberalism, more direction from government doing more to protect people. And the more you expect government to protect you from the day-to-day problems of living, the less freedom you will take in return. Now, he was basically saying that there's no point us blaming the politicians because they will just respond to what the public wants.
Yeah.
And if the public want less freedom, then that has got pretty big consequences for conservatism. And I think in that speech, he made a point more subtle and more profound than anything that I've heard any of our politicians make over here in London, that we need to reflect that there is a social trend right now away from freedom. And there is an expectation that government will protect us from more of life's ups and downs. And one of the tricks for conservatives is to try to make the case for liberty, to try to make the case for freedom. Because if the average voters aren't going to buy it, then the politicians won't be able to sell it.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the other points he made, which I was struck by, is how rare democracy is. I mean, particularly liberal democracy. And in the end, democracies tend to commit suicide rather than be attacked and brought down from without. It is actually internal desires and problems, crises that end them.
And normally it's a crisis of confidence. Normally it's when the society looks around and says, you know, we are not good people. And you can see that right now.
Yeah.
You can see so much debate, which is looking at how terribly racist we all are, even though as a Western civilization, we have never made more progress against poverty. We've never made more progress on the environment. Certainly in Britain, in many ways, by no means an expert in Australia, but I've been looking at the metrics. All of these things, racial injustice, we're living in a golden era of progressive success. And yet the narrative is that this is all a terrible failure. We need to take drastic steps to stop it. And of course, you guys are having a referendum about the very basis of your democracy in about a week's time. So it seems to be a strange combination of social and economic achievement at the same time as a crisis of confidence. And that's happening in America, in Europe and Australia.
Indeed. And you, of course, are arriving right on polling day, I believe, into Australia. So you will experience the result of the Australian people's decision on whether to establish this separate body, a voice to our parliament. But looking at the polls, it looks like people are opting, as they almost always do in Australia, for the conservative approach and opting not to change. But we will see. The polls have been wrong before, Fraser, as you know.
They have been, but I also see in the Australian polls a reflection of the Brexit polls in Britain. Yes. It starts off being, of course, thinking, and the language, by the way, that I hear from the Yes camp in Australia is very similar to the Remain camp. This isn't really about the question on the ballot paper. This is about whether we are a good and a decent society that look at all these guys voting no or for voting Brexit. These are the knuckle draggers. We can't possibly let them win. The moment you start using that language, you're probably losing the argument. So I can see big reflections here in Brexit. And when an argument goes that way, effectively, though you don't intend to, you end up basically insulting those who might have sympathy with no. This gets their backs up. And the group that Robert Menzies called the Forgotten People will tend to have the final say.
Yeah, I totally agree, Fraser. I followed the Brexit campaign extremely closely from here in down under, and there are a lot of similarities, I think, between these two campaigns. The Yes campaign has been, like the Remain campaign in Brexit, driven by elites, corporate Australia, actors, actresses, high-profile public intellectuals, obviously politicians who tend to lean left. A lot of social media influencers post regularly about how it's morally right to be voting at yes. And that sort of language about the morality of a yes vote, rather than respecting the fact it's people's democratic right to vote yes or no. You're a bad person if you vote no. As you say, like with Brexit, people get their backs up. And it's interesting on my social media feeds how people will post, I'm voting yes, as a sort of a nod to their virtue. And then there's just silence from so many other people. And I don't know, maybe they agree or maybe they are voting no and they just decide to keep it to themselves, that shy Tory.
Yeah, that is the problem, because you know that if you will confess your true political allegiance, this might mean trouble for you in the workplace. It might mean trouble for you in larger society. And by the way, not that I would draw any connection between the principles of Brexit and voting for Donald Trump. The same thing was happening over there in the Trump campaign. I mean, Trump got elected after Hillary Clinton started calling his followers the deplorables.
Yeah.
When one side tries to draw a moral line, rather than saying this is a political disagreement, but this is a battle between good and evil, between progress and regressivism, between the future and the past, then that does tend to release rather a powerful counter-reaction. And what happened with Brexit was the people who don't normally vote at all in any general election started to vote in the Brexit referendum. And this can be the case simply because you get their backs up so much that they will make a trip to the ballot box. Now, this normally surprises opinion pollsters because opinion pollsters quite often just don't bother sampling the opinion of these forgotten people because they are forgotten people. Their voices tend not to be relevant in elections. And then you find out where the centre ground of politics really is. And so often that centre ground is significantly to the right of the middle ground of the political elites.
Yes, it's an interesting phenomenon both in the United States and Britain. Of course, in Australia, we have this curiosity of compulsory voting. So irrespective of your disengagement with the issues, even in this referendum, everyone who is enrolled to vote has to at least attend the ballot. Whether they spoil their ballot or not is their own affair. But yes, it does mean our polling probably is a bit more accurate than British and US polling.
Yeah, and that polling does point to no results, doesn't it, right now? And that trend seems to be being reinforced. I mean, I've sort of, in my role as a political journalist, I've given up predicting the outcomes of elections. I gave that up in 2015 when David Cameron won his majority against all expectations. Now, when the Brexit ball came along, nobody expected Brexit to win. When Trump came along, I think Yale University gave him a 2% chance of success. And these are some of the best sophologists in the world. So time after time after time, the voters have defied the expectations of the sophologists and the opinion polls. Now, perhaps Australia does have a better track record because of a turnout system and the more comprehensive polling. I still think that we're living in a thrillingly unpredictable time for politics. Any pattern of thinking or behaviour that you might try to foist upon electorates always tends to be proven false, because there is no algorithm for voter behaviour. There is no formula for political progress. People define it in lots of ways, and quite often the big priorities which they've got, if they're not reflected by politicians, then they will find a way of asserting them. And I always think that the role of a conservative is to be relatively modest about that, just to understand how much problems that there are that we don't know and we're not prioritising right now, and to keep an open mind about responding quickly. The moment that you think that you have got to the answer and you're not going to deviate from it is the moment you create a political space for other parties. That's been the case in Europe, where we've seen populism rise in almost every single European country there is. And the populists, in my view, only ever arise because there's a major concern which is not being addressed by the main political parties. So you need to create a vacuum for populists. Now, Britain is the only country in Europe where there are no populists in Parliament. There are no populists with any significant percentage in the opinion polls. And that, in my view, is because of Brexit. Brexit was a very, very painful realignment of our elite politics with the public's priorities. And when that realignment happened, it was, of course, hugely painful for David Cameron, hugely painful for Miliband, the Labour leader. But it did mean that there was far less space in our politics for populists. And that, I think, has shown the key, that there will always be a surprise if the elites do get out of line. And this happens from time to time. So to remedy this, you need a political purge, a political correction. And it's as painful politically as having a dislocated shoulder put back into place. That's what it feels like. It's agony. But when it happens, you end up in a situation we have in Britain where Labour is probably going to win our next election. But we are not thinking, as the French are, as the Swedes are, as the Germans are, that there's going to be some new party which is anti-immigration, probably a little bit racist, about to get any serious power. That is one of the many problems that Britain doesn't have right now.
Yes, and it's extraordinary. I mean, Australia has this, again, another curiosity of preferential voting. So it's compulsory and preferential. And then we have a Senate where parties get a seat when they get a certain quota of votes. So that, of course, does enable much smaller parties to have some sense of representation. But we had, I would say, more of a left populist movement, the Teals in Australia at our last election, who won a swathe of very, very traditional Liberal Party seats. And they were all women. They were all highly professional. They all spoke strongly on climate change, which was a big issue, strongly on integrity, and strongly on the good treatment of women, of female representation. And they did incredibly well. They came out of absolutely nowhere. They were well funded by some significant business people. And they were a completely out of left field populist movement, and it'll be interesting to see how they can go on. But I think it is often down to the political system that you vote in, how votes are counted and how seats are allocated. But Fraser, I did want to get on to conservatism and some of your thoughts. You've been at Labor Party conference and the Conservative Party conference over the last 2 weekends, so you're probably feeling a little world weary now after all that conferencing. But I mean, it's fair to say, despite the fact that Conservatives have been in government for 13 years, isn't it, since 2010 in Britain, it's not a great time for them. I think the last poll I checked, they were 10 to 15 points behind. And it doesn't seem that Prime Minister Rishi Sunak can get a trick. Anything he announces seems to just be sort of, it's just not enough, mate, it's too late, as we would say in Australia. But where is the Conservative Party in Britain ideologically? Where is it sitting? Because it seems like it is quite divided. And from Australians sitting down under, it's hard to understand how we can implant that into our own political party system.
Well, it's very complicated. I mean, first of all, you're right about the plight of the Conservatives. They are basically 16 points behind Labour. It is almost unheard of for a governing party to come back from being so far behind in the polls for so long. And by the way, the 16 points is quite good for them. They're normally 20 points behind. If you look at the betting markets, as I do time to time, it will say that there is a 91% chance of Labour winning the next election. And broadly speaking, I would say that sounds right to me. The problem is the majority the Conservatives are defending was won by Boris Johnson. Yeah. It was won by him straight in the aftermath of a Brexit vote where he managed to convert the Brexit coalition of voters. We're talking a whole bunch of working class, normally Labour voters in seats in the north of England or don't normally vote Conservative. He managed to turn that into a political coalition and persuade them to vote for him, not necessarily for the Conservative Party. Of course, in our system, you go into a polling booth and you will choose your local candidates and his party or her party. But quite often the tone of the campaign is presidential. So Boris Johnson would say, look, it's me versus Jeremy Corbyn. I'm going to get Brexit done properly. And he managed to harness that sense of optimism there was in the country about the new turn that Brexit had just taken, or the way that a lot of people saw it. It was a heroic step that the British had made, that in defiance of all the leaderships of all main political parties, in defiance of the trade unions, of all the employers' unions, we had voted no as a country, albeit by a slim margin of 52%. Now, because the Conservatives didn't lead this vote, they weren't quite sure what to do with it when they arrived. Boris Johnson himself was a late convert to the Brexit cause, and they really struggled to come up with a kind of follow-up for this. They sort of said, okay, well, Brexit, we're going to control immigration. And broadly speaking, that should mean that there's going to be higher wages for lower skilled people here because mass immigration has decreased lower wages. So they tried to put together an agenda, and the spirit was willing, but the flesh was weak. In the end, Britain has ended up pretty much doubling immigration. And we had 1 million immigrants come in the last calendar year where it was announced. Then lockdown came along, and lockdown changed everything, as it did in lots of countries. Now, looking around the world, there aren't that many governments who implemented lockdown, who survived the political aftermath. It was a gamble. It was unscientific gamble. It caused untold kind of economic and social problems. My wife is from Sweden, and as a result, I spend about as much of my time as possible in Sweden. And there, they didn't lock down. And they had minimal economic damage, no economic disruption. They weirdly chose the most liberal thing to do, where who else was in power, either in Australia or in Europe, left or right. They went for the same quasi-authoritarian response on the basis of no real public health or scientific backing at all. And a lot of them simply weren't forgiven for it. Now, this completely destroyed Boris Johnson's liberal vibe. He had been positioning himself as the man who believes in Merry England conservatism, who wants to save you from a nanny state, to let people do what they want. But after lockdown, that became very difficult. The economic damage became so big. The educational damage is probably irreparable. And then Boris Johnson just never quite managed to stabilize his government after that. So you end up with this debacle of not him being forced out by a small bunch of plotters. He ended up with so little support in his party that he couldn't find enough people to serve in his government. This is the first time it had ever happened in the British context. So we had to resign. And then we had the Conservatives' leadership contest. Now, they rigged that contest. They allowed 5 or 6 people to stand. And there was a candidate, Kemi Badenoch, this Nigerian immigrant, one of the very few immigrants to reach the top of British public life. And she was very, very popular. Polls show she would have won the contest had the Conservatives allowed her to go through to the membership. But they didn't. They only allowed the 2 candidates with the most votes amongst MPs to go through. That was Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. Of those 2, Liz Truss is the better campaigner, so she won. Now, that was a disaster. That lasted for 44 days. But during that disaster, she pretty much destroyed what was left of the Conservatives' reputation for economic competence. Now, when that happened, Rishi Sunak, who's, by the way, very competent in economics, probably the cleverest guy ever to sit in 10 Downing Street, came along to repair the damage. But the damage was simply so great that he hasn't been able to make much progress. And now at the Conservative Party conference, he's positioned himself as the man who's going to make long-term decisions, but he's defining himself against what he calls a 30-year consensus, a failed consensus. Now, he's choosing 30 years because he wants to lump together Labour and his Conservative predecessors, David Cameron and Boris Johnson. And it's a bit of an ask, really, to say that the choice is not really between Labour or Tory. The choice is between me and the consensus, and my opponent is part of the old consensus. I'm not sure if voters are going to do that. I think voters are going to think to themselves, do the Conservatives really deserve a 5th parliamentary term? And I suspect those voters are going to decide, no, they don't.
No, well, it sounds like that's exactly going to be the decision. It would be interesting, Fraser, to understand what are the internal fissures within the Conservative Party at the moment. In Australia, we would see there being quite a divide between the sort of left of the capital L Liberal Party who tend to be very socially liberal, socially progressive, and then economically quite conservative. And then on the other side, the right of the party, they would be much more socially conservative, and then economically they're quite happy with a bit of big spending and state control over market, state intervention into markets. So you do see that divide quite a bit. And depending on the political cycle, it can be the death of the Liberal Party is nigh, the Liberal Party won't make its 80-year anniversary next year, or in the good times, the differences are smoothed over and the party is a broad church and all committed to basically the individual and individual freedoms.
Well, in the UK Conservative Party right now, the various factions, their identities has been subdued by the fact that 3 out of 4 of these MPs think they're going to lose their seat at the next election. So the survival instinct has kicked in and has supplanted their overall political preferences.
Right.
Now, and when it comes to culture, the Conservatives are actually quite socially liberal. There's the Conservatives were the party that brought in gay marriage and they still support that. The only question is how actively to fight the woke wars, as it were.
Yeah.
Now, I was talking earlier about Kemi Badenoch, who, by the way, is a former colleague of mine at The Spectator. So she follows footsteps of Nigel Lawson and Boris Johnson and Ian MacLeod as being Spectator journalists to also be very prominent in politics. Now, Kemi believes, and I think she's right, that there is a new generation for whom wokeness or identity politics, whatever you want to call it, is now the dividing line in politics. Now, I grew up in the Cold War. For me, that was the dividing line. You can argue, for some conservatives, the dividing line is high tax versus low tax, or strong in defence versus not so strong. For some people, the dividing line still is Brexit versus Remain. But for a new generation, the dividing line is whether you're going to succumb to identity politics and see what Kemi regards as the revival of racism, effectively. The revival of the idea that people should be a skin colour first and a person second. Now, she is absolutely appalled by this, and she thinks the Conservatives should fight it and fight for the principles of Martin Luther King, who was saying, of course, famously, that his dream involved people being judged by the content of the character, not the colour of their skin. And Kemi's argument is that we've moved away from this, and a new movement has grown up, thinking that when we talk about universal values, this is actually a cover for racism, and the universal values should be attacked. She thinks they should be vigorously defended, and also she regards with suspicion the rise of authoritarianism in the day-to-day language, like obliging people to use pronouns that they may or may not disagree with, those sort of things. Now, Rishi Sunak is a bit less comfortable with this. He thinks, look, this is all a bit sort of Twitter, it's all a bit culture wars. Let's not really engage with this. I mean, yes, a woman is a woman. He said that in his party conference speech as if he was saying something controversial. The controversy, of course, is whether you regard a trans woman to be a woman. But he wants to dial that down, where Kemi wants to put this front and centre, saying this is the new Conservative battle. Now, I think that she is right, certainly for a younger generation of voters. I know from our own research that the readers who come to The Spectator under the age of 30 tend to be those who've been exposed to the worst excesses of identity politics at school and at university. And it offends their basic sense of fairness and justice and community and cohesion. And they're looking for a progressive fight back against the new forces of intolerance who are in the ascendant. So I would describe, by the way, I don't think any conservative, there are a few conservatives like Penny Mordaunt, for example, who have gone along with gender self-ID. In other words, anybody who wants to call themselves a woman should be regarded as one. There have been, I'd say, about probably a quarter of conservatives would go along with that, but 3/4 wouldn't. But the main dividing line is between those who think there should be a major distinctive feature, a campaigning feature of conservatism, and those who don't. And the other problem for those who do is, how do you find a vocabulary for this? How do you manage to talk about this in a way that doesn't allow your opponents to describe you as being racist or thinking that Black lives don't matter? That's a great verbal trap. When you say the words Black Lives Matter, if you do, then you're on one side of a divide. And if you don't, does that mean you think that Black lives don't matter? Now, Kemi Badenoch has been, I think, a pioneer in coming out with her own vocabulary. And of course, the fact that she is a Nigerian immigrant who chose Britain and is probably the most, I want to say vicious, but I don't mean vicious. She's the most muscular defender of British liberal values that I know in Parliament, because she comes from a country where politics is a lot more visceral, a lot more competitive. And she believes you do have to fight, and fight again for the values and the principles that you love. That's her sort of politics. And I suspect that if Rishi Sunak does no longer become Conservative leader, then it's Kemi and her style of conservatism that will succeed him. But for now, it's just too late, because the Conservatives are adopting the brace position ahead of the crash of the next general election.
Which is very sad when it all boils down to an individual politician's survival rather than actually, I guess, what Margaret Thatcher and Keith Joseph were committed to, the conviction politician who will put it on the line for what they believe in rather than just to save their bacon.
The funny thing is that Rishi Sunak does have principles, but he's on the position of, okay, we can't go for these principles now. We need to do something before we get to that point. That was David Cameron's point of view. That was George Osborne's point of view. Now, these principles are fine, but just not yet. Let's implement them later after X, Y, and Z. And the problem is that X, Y, and Z never seems to end. So you end up with the Thomas Aquinas view of conservatism. Make me a conservative lord, but just not yet.
How does the Conservative Party overcome? It's an issue that the Liberal Party, I think, in Australia is grappling with, especially with the rise of the Teals in their heartland seats. How does the Conservative Party grapple with those voters who were traditional Labor working class voters from, say, the north of England beyond that red wall, who either didn't vote or they really didn't see the Conservative Party as their political home, but something about Boris Johnson's rhetoric and campaigning around Brexit attracted them to him, and they presumably are now looking at the mess of the Conservative Party's messaging at the moment, thinking, not sure if it's the home for me. But how does the Conservative Party win those votes, but at the same time win some of their heartland, the nice electorates in Surrey with people who are professional, traditional Conservative voters, probably quite socially liberal, focused on issues that probably are less hip pocket and more fashionable?
Well, this is, of course, the split. I think one of the trends that we're seeing in all Western societies is the divergence of cultures within cities and the regions. So the metropolitan areas tend to be getting their own very powerful agenda, that you want to be adopting fashionable causes, absolutely adopting the net zero agenda, and doing a whole bunch of things because it's an exciting new movement here. And also the cities tend to have been more prosperous over the last sort of 10, 20 years at the expense of the regions where people seem to feel undervalued and overlooked. Now, this is, of course, a challenge for any kind of one nation conservative because you want to be able to talk to both. This has been more of a trap, I think, for the left than it has been for the right, because the lefts tend to gravitate towards these metropolitan liberal values. So they will go a little bit overboard with net zero. They will tend to adopt a more extreme interpretation of environmentalism, which overlooks the fact that you are basically conspiring to tax the poor out of the sky and off the roads and to make huge economic sacrifices off the low paid in order to pursue an objective which probably wouldn't even move the dial on climate change. So that's trap number one for the left. Trap number two for the left is to get caught up in the culture wars, effectively, to regard it as progress rather than culture war, rather than see it what it is, and also try to expand your definition of what proportion of the population should count as racist or sexist. Now, when the left do that, it should present a fairly easy opportunity for the right simply to be a bit more open-minded, a bit less prescriptive. This is what Boris Johnson did. He was hoovering up Labour votes, not because he really had won them over. I mean, sure, they were interested by his prospect of having a post-Brexit project. But what had really happened was that the Labour Party had abandoned them, steadily abandoned them over the course of 2 decades. So they were in the market for a new political home, and one that Boris Johnson was able to offer them. Now, the same is true for Trump, by the way. If you look at Trump's voters, you can see they're in the same sort of demographic. And in Europe, continental Europe, populist voters tend to be in this graphic as well. It's the lower middle class, working class, what in Britain is called the C2 voters, the sans-culottes, as they're called in French. The similar sort of people there who you can respond to by the parties that have done it well have tended to use, first of all, patriotism, because patriotism and love of your country tends to be an unfashionable concept amongst the metropolitan elites. It seems to be regressive, to have a racial component sometimes. And this underestimates, I think, how the nation state has got a social component for a lot of those who feel on the losing end of globalization, who feel that globalizing trends is making life worse for them and their families and their communities. They quite understandably look to the nation state for protection. Now, this has been a big problem in Europe because the nation state has been constantly undermined by the EU, and the symbol of this has been migration, letting in hundreds of thousands of people who introducing a whole bunch of social problems. In Sweden, for example, there is just a staggering gang crime problem right now, whereby Stockholm is way bigger than London now per capita for gun crime and shootings and the rest of it. And you can see similar versions of this all over Europe, but your average voter sees the nation state under threat. Of course, you in Australia have managed to defend this quite well. I think Tony Abbott's policy on turning back the boats, for example, is the sort of thing that the Conservatives are reaching for now. But going back to the overall point about the demographics and the voters and how you reach them typically with a language of patriotism, because by and large, they do love their country, and that doesn't make them bad people. You don't make out that they are racist or sexist because of the pronouns of a language which they might use in a day-to-day place. You're a little bit more sympathetic about the fact that globalization does benefit the university-educated city elites a lot more than it does those who didn't even finish school. And you need to have a narrative that doesn't make those who finish school think that they're now regarded as the roadkill of globalization. You need to come up with policies that will give them dignity, that will persuade them that there is a brighter future for them can be built. A lot of Brexit was about that. So there are lots of things that you can do, but to do this, you need to accept the opprobrium of the metropolitan elite. And quite often you need to spend an election campaign being called racists and sexist or all sorts of other things, or bigots, by a lot of the city's media elite. Now, that's what Boris Johnson did. He spent that campaign being called Islamophobic, a bigot, a sexist, all sorts of things. The same was Trump. He was called all sorts of names throughout his campaign. It goes to show you, in my view, just how ineffective the media is now in telling people how to vote. But it does mean that you have to fight a campaign defining yourself against almost some of the more recently invented fashions and hastily assembled altars in front of which we're now expected to genuflect. If you want to come up with a sort of conservatism that will appeal to voters right across the country, the small towns as well as the cities, then that needs perhaps a more coarse sort of vocabulary, but certainly a political message that is going to lose you votes in the places where, if you're a politician, you tend to live and work. And that can be quite difficult for a lot of them.
Yes, and it's something that came up in the 2022 federal election in Australia when the Liberal Party lost seats to the Teals. There was this debate whether the Liberal Party should just give up on those seats, these sort of inner metropolitan seats, highly affluent seats that they had always won, never ever had an issue winning. They'd take them for granted and put the campaign funds elsewhere around the country. But there is a debate that you've got to just give up on those seats, that these metropolitan professionals, highly educated, highly affluent, focused on fashionable issues rather than hip pocket issues, that they are just a lost cause now for the centre-right. Leave them to the left, to the teal populists. But there's also the other side of the debate is, well, no, you never give up on any vote. You should always go after every vote. And once the economy starts to really founder with geopolitical issues and high inflation and recovering from the massive COVID debts, that these seats will come back when the economic realities really do hit them. We haven't seen that yet. It was certainly a phenomenon over one election. I'd like to see many more elections to determine the actual trend, but It seems like in Britain you're experiencing the same debate. Where do you focus your electoral campaign energies, and do you give up on certain constituencies as a lost cause or not?
Well, I think when you start to think about it in those terms, you succumb to the temptation which has so disfigured conservatism around the world, that you're taking tactical decisions. You're losing sight of your principles, that you are trying to think, if I say X, then I'm going to get a vote from voter Y. And if you decide your whole strategy in terms of focus groups and polling and what message resonates with whom, then you risk getting into the state that the British Conservatives are in now, where you're neither fish nor fowl. You don't really look conservative because you're spending so much money and you're taxing the bejesus out of the population, but nor do you particularly look progressive because you're never going to be outbid on fashionable causes by the left. Now, I think this is at times of disorientation. It behoves conservatives to go back to first principles. And the problem, because conservatives aren't ideologues, that there isn't a sort of founding text here, but you can look upon the basic messages which previous leaders have done. Now, in my case, everybody in conservatism has got their own sort of heroes. In my case, I'm more of a Thatcher Reagan kind of guy, I think, because I would describe myself as liberal more than the conservative. And I think both of those two described essential liberal values. And of course, in Australia, you guys don't have a conservative party, you've got a liberal party.
Yes.
Which Robert Menzies put together. And for precisely these reasons, this is the principles he was saying that should unite all of these various factions and we can fight for liberal beliefs. And I think that's simply what you do. These things should have universal appeal. And what you do, rather than thinking how you can come up with a trick to win this voter X, Y, or Z, you can simply go back to your principles and try to explain why these are progressive principles, why these will lead to a more cohesive society, a fairer society. They will mean greater environmental progress, and they will take the country as a unit together more. And so you can try to just find people to buy your politics, to try to do your best to take the voters to where your politics are, rather than take your politics to where you think the voters might be. If you do it the wrong way around, then you just end up in a mess that is not liberal, that is difficult to reconcile with any sort of coherence. And this isn't about ideology. This is about a simple question. What do these guys believe? Do my values align with their values? Now, a lot of voters will vote out of economic self-interest. But that used to work for the Conservatives back in the day, where you'd win the prosperous cities by saying, well, you know what, we believe in low taxes, low regulation, sound money, and we are going to get votes from people who have done well economically, and they want the system to continue. That stopped working for Conservatives around the world some time ago, because what happened was that the rich elite started defining themselves more on their fashionable values than the economic self-interest. Now, when that happens, then the economic play won't work, and you need other ways of trying to sell it. So the way of selling economic liberalism now, I would argue, is trying to point out its successes. This is the best method for allowing people to help themselves, to help their family. Though people who voted for Boris Johnson, they didn't want government handouts. They didn't really want subsidies. They just wanted the ability to help themselves, help their families, help their communities a little bit more. They would like a government that would take away less of what they earned, and a government that looked at them not as charity cases, but as equal citizens who deserved more agency and more respect in the national conversation. So there are a whole bunch of ways that you can do this. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's about giving up on any bunch of voters, because I think that conservatism, if sold properly, has got far more of an appeal to your average prosperous Australian or Brit or German. The way to sell it isn't on these one nation principles, that we cannot now engage in some new divisive form of imported American wokery that is going to re-racialize society. That's the Kemi Beatenoch word, by the way. She introduced it at the conference, to re-racialize society.
Yeah.
That conservatives stand for universal values. And if you cared about equality, then you care very much about making sure your representation treats everybody equally. As far as I can work out, that's one of the principles behind the No campaign in Australia. The need to treat everybody equally, not to come up with a new formula which would treat people of different races differently in a democracy. So these universal values are still worth fighting for. And in my view, this will be the next Conservative mission. Whether the Conservatives are in a place yet where they can understand or articulate that is another matter entirely.
It sounds like, Fraser, from what you've just said then, that we need another Margaret Thatcher. Maybe that's Kemi Badenoch. We'll see. But I grew up a child of the 80s, similar age to you, 80s and 90s. So Margaret Thatcher was my absolute political hero with Ronald Reagan, and that clear articulation and conviction that she had around a set of values and principles, and her huge bravery in confronting vested interests, organised labour, a totally broken system, but with hugely influential groups pushing back at her, trying to reform it. And she was successful, and Britain was the better country for it. But it takes huge bravery to do that, and belief in what you stand for. And as you say, not sitting there looking at the polls and, will we win these seats if we announce that? And, a bit of pork barrelling here. Maybe that'll flip a few more votes. I think the time for the conviction Conservative politician is now.
Well, it's funny. There's an expression that British Conservatives use. You have to go through Heath to get to Thatcher. In other words, you need to go through complete despair and bedlam before you can rediscover your principles. Now, perhaps Australian Liberals are in that situation now, given that you've got Tasmania and pretty much nothing left. British Conservatives perhaps will have to endure a pretty big defeat to be forced to go back to principles, to what they stand in, and how that is interpreted and explained to the modern world. So that's my gut feeling right now, that they have been able to renew in office. It will take a defeat, but the Australian Conservatives or Australian Liberals can at least say that you're a few years ahead of us in that process.
Indeed. Well, Fraser Nelson, absolute delight to have you on Afternoon Light. This is a great taste of the conversations to come and your oration to come, and we're very much looking forward to hosting you here down under.
I can't wait to come, Georgina. Look very much forward to seeing you in Melbourne.
Thanks, Fraser. That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.